The man that you're looking at is Titinga Frederic Pacere. He is a lawyer, very prominent lawyer. He in Burkina Faso. He is a poet. He is a writer of many, many books, more than 60 different volumes that he's written. He comes from a village named Mananga, which is outside of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. And in his lifetime, he has converted his village into a living museum, a cultural space that one can visit and see how the Mossi have lived and continue to live. He is a true defender of traditional Mossi culture, and his achievements are staggering, really, when one considers how much he's done in his lifetime. It's just amazing what he's been able to accomplish. Now, the poem that we're going to look at in this particular lecture is a poem that it was hard to say that he wrote it because he more transcribed it or translated it. It's called Saglego, Drum Poem for the Sahel. And this is a poem that is a transcription of the language of the talking drums. And now, as we're going to discuss, African languages are tonal, and so there is a close relationship between the language of the talking drums and the human voice. And historically, like theorists of the talking drums, like Walter J. Ong, have said that the players of the drum copy the tones of the human voice. Well, Pacere turns that on its head because essentially he argues that it is the human voice that copies the drum, or that the drum is itself prior to the human voice. And so it's a very interesting view of traditional Mossi culture and drum language of the talking drum that he has articulated. And but in his view, he's not, inventing a new theory. He's simply trying to preserve the traditional culture of the Mossi and translate it for us, transmit it for us. And he does this in the face of his concern about what he saw in his lifetime as a process wherein traditional Mossi culture seemed to be threatened. First, in the sense that many Mossi converted to Islam and rejected the traditional animist beliefs of the past. And then later, there are many Mossi who converted to Islam. And so he was a defender of traditional Mossi culture, which was a animist culture. Now, he's still alive. He's very old at the time that this lecture is being recorded. But he has so many books. I have a whole shelf of them at home, and they're just I don't have all of them because, like I said, he has more than 60. But there's a lot. He just produced a lot, and he was driven by the desire to preserve a culture that he perceived as disappearing before his very eyes. At one point, he makes the comparison with putting a message in a bottle and throwing it out to sea, and he says, well, sometimes these messages are fished out of the sea and out of the bottle, and so he was guided in large measure by the desire, the will to preserve traditional Mossi culture, and he just did an amazing job. Now, we're looking at only one very small drum poem that he wrote, so this is one poem among many other products he created. He also he got his start as a poet of writing in the French language, and he became increasingly dissatisfied with the limitations of French. But he wrote in his earlier days. He wrote traditional, poetry in the French language, so he was a French language poet as well. Here, as you can see, he was born in 1943. To my knowledge, this poem that I'm presenting to you is the only work of his that has been translated into English. Now, I did read that the volume Ainsi on a assassiné tous les Mossi has been translated into English. This is a work of history, but I have not found this volume, but I did hear it was translated, but I was not able to locate it just yet. So that one may be translated, and it literally is, and thus one has killed all the Mossis. It's a history of what happened to the Mossi during the period of colonization when the French colonized this part of what is today Burkina Faso. But he also wrote La Poésie des Griots, which is the poem of the griots. Le langage des tam-tams et des masques en Afrique. This is the language of the tam-tams or the drums and masks in Africa. This is a major work. It's a really interesting, very, very thick volume, which goes into detail about, this, what he's calling the language of the talking drums and the masks, and what's really going on in the language of the drums, which is far more complex than one might imagine. Now the topic itself is extraordinarily complex. Let me say that. And we're not going to get into all the subtleties of his theory, and there are some debates about his theory. Albert Ouedraogo, for instance, made an interesting semiotic response to it. So there's a lot of things that one could say, but it's so complicated. So this lecture is intended really for people who have never heard of Pacere and don't know anything about the language of the talking drum. So this is a really basic, introduction. I'm going to present to you a couple of brief little videos of the talking drums to get you a sense of what is going on in this language, and then so we'll talk about talking drums more generally. I'll show you a video about that, one from Ghana, and then we'll look at the particular case of the Mossi and what Titinga Frederic is saying about the language of the talking drums, and what he's going to call cultural literature, and then we're going to look at some passages from this poem, Saglego, or drum poem for the Sahel. Now, again, the Mossi culture, the Burkina Faso is, as I've said in lectures on Norbert Zongo and Thomas Sankara, and previous to this lecture, it's a very poor country, one of the poorest countries in the world. And the Mossi have lived in the Ouagadougou area for many hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, like the Yoyantsi, the ancestors of the earth, the oldest group among the Mossi, and they've been there such a long time. But they've dealt with very difficult living circumstances, very difficult living conditions, and the Mossi kingdom, you can see here. I'm going to show you. Let me show you first this map here. Here is a map of the traditional ethnic groups in what is today Burkina Faso, and the Mossi Empire was one of the things that enabled it to survive through the millennia was that it was precisely the language of the talking drum. So let's say, for instance, if slave traders came into this part of West Africa, the language of the talking drums would send messages all the way back to the Ouagadougou, which is where the Moranaba or the king resided, and the whole kingdom would be alerted to this. And in addition, the language of the talking drums could transmit administrative messages, instructions from the Moranaba and Ouagadougou. So it really was like a kind of a writing that was used to administrate a kingdom, or an empire, but it was done through the drums. And so the drums are very, very complex, and the system of language within them is quite complex, as we're going to see. But it serves, in addition to serving a sacred function, it also served a practical function to help administrate the bureaucratic kingdom of the Moranaba in Ouagadougou, and to keep this solid empire and protect it from intrusions, not just from, I'm not talking about when I say from slavers, like for instance, the Songhay came down and attacked it during the era of the Esquias, and then the Mossi went up and at one point were known to have sacked Timbuktu. So they always have been very fierce, historically they were fierce, they fiercely resisted conversion to Islam in a world that over the hundreds of years since the coming of Islam about 1,000 years ago has gradually become more Islamic. But the Mossi, up until very recently, seemed to be immune to conversion to Islam. But then during the French colonial era, some Mossi became Catholic, and over the last 60 years or so, more Mossi have become Muslim, and less are animist than in the past. And it was this threat that really motivated Pacere to make sure that the traditional knowledge of the Mossi was preserved before a generation of people died off, and the knowledge of the past would be lost. And he was convinced, and he was of course right, that this was a precious resource that he needed to preserve, document, and record. And thanks to him, we have so many documents today of traditional Mossi culture that scholars can study, and those who want to learn about this culture can study, and the history of Africa can study. Now I'm going to show you a brief clip of Maître Titinga Frederic Pacere reading some of his poetry, so you get a sense of what he sounds like and what he looks like.
Mon fils, don donner, don donner, don donner. Don donner, je chante des tropiques du Sahel, l'Afrique et le monde. Je psalmodie sur la terre de mes pères pour l'Orient et l'Occident, en couvrant les jours et les nuits de lait, de miel des saisons. Je parcourais les continents pour la gloire de Dieu et mes pères. La musique est le langage de langage. La parole qui d'Odeline conduit au berceau de la nuit. Mon fils, écoute au rythme des bracelets, la mer qui rappelle, qui aime et qui appelle.
Okay, so that's him reciting some of his French poetry. You can see that was recited accompanied by the drum, and the drum for him and for the Mossi in general is a very important instrument, as we're going to see. Now here again are some images. There's the Moro Naba on the top right. There's a stamp of him from the former Upper Volta. He was the emperor, the king of the Mossi. And you can see the traditional Mossi houses, how the Mossi have historically lived, and some of their headdress and during the festival of the masks, so that when, for instance, some of the drum poems would be performed, they would be accompanied by dancing and the procession of the masks. And so the masks are very important for the Mossi, as for many other African peoples as well in West Africa. Now, Amadou Hampâté Bâ, the cousin of Sékou Tall, once said, "The death of an old man in Africa is like a library burning down." If you do much African studies, you'll hear this quote a lot. It's one of those things that has become very famous, kind of saying, almost a slogan. But Titinga Frederic Pacere, in some sense, refutes it, because he says, here's his response to this. He says, "It is a cruel fact, but there are even living libraries who will die while still alive, living libraries who are already dead." So this is, again, him lamenting the neglect of traditional culture. And you have to remember that particularly during the colonial era, the era in which, like Patrice Ilbadou would say, an area which implied the need for a kind of a toilettage, or a cleaning up, because the French colonial period was a period in which the Mossi, who are very virtuous people, set a very high premium on virtuous, upright integrity and ethical behavior. In fact, as I've said in the lecture on Saqqara, the name Burkina Faso means land of the virtuous or upright people, felt defiled during this colonial era. It was a wound to one's dignity to live through this period, in addition to being a very deadly period, many people being killed. But but some were made to feel that in the face of the French colonial propaganda that was being promoted, it was that traditional African culture was simply worthless. And so many people just ceased to preserve some of the traditions of the past. And this is what he's referring to. He's saying, look, we've got living libraries who are still alive, and so they may, let's preserve this. Let's awaken what's already there. Not just lament those who die as if it's gone and it's gone forever. We can save some of this, was his sentiment. Now here are images of Mananga. his village that he has converted into a museum. And if you ever go to Ouagadougou, it's just a short drive outside of Ouagadougou. It's a wonderful place to visit. It really gives you great insight into what traditional Mossi culture was like, and much of the things that or the issues, cultural artifacts and so on that Pacere discusses in his books, you'll find there on display in this museum. And so it's a must-see museum, the Museum of Menenga, if you have a chance to go to Burkina Faso or Ouagadougou. Now here's Titinga Frederic on Western misconceptions about literacy in Africa. This is one of the things that motivates him to collect this information and these documents and these cultural artifacts. He says, terms like oral literature in the West are loaded with partial, pejorative, simplistic, and iconoclastic meanings which commit great violence against the profound and non-written literature of Africa, promoting the false, unstated assumption that Africa lacked the ability to develop writing systems and that writing itself is the alpha and omega of all things. This is something we've always deplored about the Occident, the so-called civilized world, which cannot transcend its deeply entrenched beliefs about speaking and writing. Now, Pacere's views here are very similar to those of, say, Falou Ngom, who initiated the Ajame project at Boston University to document, the vast Ajame literature that exists in West Africa, which is to say African language literature that's been alphabetized with an Arabic script. When we've seen, for instance, that in Timbuktu, we know there are thousands and thousands of manuscripts, that writing was always there, in the sense that it was, in fact, writing is invented in Africa. It comes from Africa, it comes from Egypt into Europe from Egypt. But there's this popular idea or the stereotype that Africa is a place without writing, which is not only preposterous and false in the sense that there is writing, there always has been writing there, but it's also preposterous and false in the sense that he's thinking of literature as, for instance, the drums themselves. The literature of the drums is a kind of a literature, but it's not. It's a kind of an inscription. It's an inscription upon the ears, but it's not a. It's a cultural literature that is very ancient, and for Pacere, it is in fact a literature. Now literally, literature refers to the idea of a letter, but he's using this term to validate these cultural productions that are ancient and that have been preserved through the centuries and that are legitimate. Now, if we put it in more modern semiotic terms, we could say, well, this is the talking drums is a text, much like any text in the West, any poetic text, and so indeed he certainly has a very valid point. So we have to change our concept. It's not just, in other words, it's not just a matter of saying that Africa had writing in the case of like Ajame that Falou Ngom speaks of, or the scriptural manuscripts in Timbuktu and Guinea and places like that, but that the language of the talking drums is also a literature and should be viewed as a literature every bit as valid as these other forms as literature as well. And that, I think, is Pacere's point here. Now, if we look here, so he uses this word, he's going to use this word bindrology, and the word bindra is a drum made from a calabash, and you can see on the far left is a bindra. Now, if you look in the middle right, you see djembes. People in the United States are more familiar with djembes, perhaps not as familiar with the bindra, which is the Mossi drum made from a calabash with the leather animal skin stretched over it. But they're very similar, but you can see it has a more round shape there. Now, on the far right, you see a djembe. The djembe, by the way, is a Mande term as opposed to bindra, which is a Moray term, which is Moray's language of the Mossi. And then you see a djembe with a kinskins, which these are resonators. Some people call them oreilles or ears. You see those metal things on the djembe which amplify the sound. Now, right next to the bindra is a lunga. This is the Moore word, Mossi word for the armpit drum. That also, you can see the little stick that's played, and when it's squeezed by under the arm of the drummer, it makes all kinds of very interesting sounds, or it can vary its sounds or tonalities through the squeezing of the strings on the side of it. So this also is a very important drum of the Mossi as well. Now here you can see the bindra, which is again the Moore word. It means the drum, particular drum made from a calabash, again with a leather animal skin stretched over it. And then it's a combination of that and the Greek word, which is logos, for discourse or word. So it's the word or discourse of the bindra. So this is a term that Pacere himself coins in his book on the language of the talking drums. Now on the far right, you see Alhaji Papa Suso. He's a griot from the Gambia. He recently passed, but he came to Western Washington University on a number of occasions, and you can see him there playing with his father's kora. That was his favorite kora, Papa Suso's. And you can see that it too is similar to the bindra, the drum, because it's made from a calabash, but it has, in this case, a neck on it with strings. And so this is the kora. And then, of course, next to him is a man playing the balafon. But so they're very similar. And so when Pacere speaks of the griot, he's using a term that is often more used with the Mande griots like El Hadji Papa Suso. We could think of a drummer as being a griot, but he's using this term in a more general sense. So the Moro well, in Burkina Faso, the Moro Naba has every morning his drummer would come out and play, and the drummer would be a kind of a griot as well, just like El Hadji Papa Suso. But in this case, he wouldn't. The music that he would make would be the drum music, not the. It wouldn't have the strings and the sound, exact same sound as the kora of El Hadji Papa Suso. Now here you can see this is a tree that the calabash grows on. I'm just putting this, including this image here, because many of us in the West don't see these kinds of trees. And I remember the first time I saw one, I thought, well, what is that? Is that a watermelon tree? Because that's kind of what it looks like. It's like watermelons growing off of a tree. But this is where the calabash comes from, and then the griot then takes it and makes the drum player makes a bindra with the calabash like this. Then also calabashes are used for drinking bowls and other eating bowls and other functions as well. Here is a video I'd like you to hear on the talking drum.
They are also a means of communication. People talk to each other by using drums. Many African languages are based on high and low sounds. For example, when the Ashantis say good morning, it sounds like this. Ma-chi, ma-chi. The word has a low sound and a high sound. Ma-chi. It can also be said by a drum that can beat both high and low sounds. Thank you, Mr. Ite. Mr. Ite has just told me you are welcome. This small drum is used for sending messages short distances. The pitch of the drum is changed by pressing on it. Mr. Ite is signaling a lion is near the village. Now saying, run, run. In former times, when lions were found in many parts of Ghana, children would run and hide when they heard this. When messages have to be sent long distances, larger drums are used. Because the sound of this kind of drum cannot be changed, more than one drum must be used to get a low sound and a high sound. The message Mr. Ite is sending is, Ohini Niba, the chief is coming. See if you can hear the words, Ohini Niba. Sometimes a message is sent from one group of drums to another a few miles away, and then to another group of drums, and then to another, until the message is heard a long distance away. Poetry is also played on the drums. Often, large groups of people gather together to listen to our poems. Instead of the poems being spoken, they are played on the drums. Let's listen now to a poem from the Ashanti tribe, which is hundreds of years old, called The Path and the River. Since I'm sure that few of you understood the poem, Miss Emerencia Tamaklo will say each part in English, Mr. Obley will repeat it in Ashanti, and Mr. Ite will play it out on the drums.
The path has crossed the river has crossed the path. Which is the elder?
Okwan twenso, usucho okwan, benyene wan.
We made the path and found the river.
Upon kwa, otonso.
But the river was made from long ago
Usu yifitete.
by the creator of the universe.
Usu yifi odoma kuma bwadia.
Now let's listen to the entire poem again, played by Mr. Ite.
So I hope that gives. Now this is the Ashanti in Ghana. There are Mossi in Ghana and northern Ghana as well. Some of the older members of the Mossi people. In this case, the French were successful in dividing up some of these cultures that had traditionally been linked. But so the Ashanti are not the same, obviously, as the Mossi. But the principle, but the talking drums were widely used by the Ashanti as well as by the Mossi. So it's a phenomenon that is not, strictly speaking, a Mossi phenomenon. It's a wider phenomenon in Africa. But I hope that gives you a sense of a different idea of what a poem is. And so when Titinga Frederic calls Saglego a drum poem, he means that literally. And what's really interesting is we're going to see, as we heard being said, that this is the poem that we just heard, that was the Ashanti poem, is hundreds of years old, and so too are many of the poems of the Mossi, and so this is partly what's going to lead Titinga Frederic to speak of the language of the talking drums as being the language of the ancestors, or an occasion through which the ancestors can continue to speak to us today. They speak to the living. The dead continue to speak to the living through the language of the talking drums. So but at the same time, the drummer can also improvise and introduce new phrases as well. So it's a kind of a dialogue between the people from the past and the present. Now, Pacere is going to emphasize, though, that the talking drums are not orality. And so this is an important point to remember, because Walter Ong wrote a very influential essay on the talking drums. Now, Walter Ong was a Catholic priest, a Jesuit, who was, who had very, what we call Christian logocentric ideas about orality and the priority of the logos. And so the view that Pacere is presenting is not a logocentric one in the same sense that Ong's is. So he's not suggesting that the drums are merely mimicking the human voice in the way that Ong suggests. That there's something else going on in the language of the talking drums that is independent of orality. We could say, in this sense, it's not the drums that imitate the human voice, but it's the human voice that imitates the drums. Here's Pacere. In defining the non-written and non-spoken literature of the drum, we are confronted with a problematic of vast proportions. Does it not compel us to rethink the very concept of African literature? Now, this is a very interesting question because it's a very radical question. I think this is one of the things that makes Pacere so interesting. Like you think of like Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his Decolonizing the Mind, who insisted that African literature should be written in African languages. But here you find Pacere going, in effect, even farther, because we need to really just revolutionize what we think of as literature, because this drum poem, for instance, this Ashanti drum poem that we just heard, is in effect a kind of literature. So we need to really broaden what we mean when we use this word. He says, the literature of the drum is not a written literature. The absence of inscribed material characters fixed with an alphabetic system prohibits us from conflating the two. So it is different from literature in that sense. However, it would be equally mistaken to confront drum literature with oral literary traditions. The drum text, the literature of the drum, is neither a written nor a spoken literature. To be precise, we are talking about an instrumental literature. So it's not, he doesn't want to just hitch it like the Ong does to the oral word, and it's not simply equivalent to a written discourse as well. It's an instrumental literature. It is its own animal, in effect, its own thing. In Africa, he writes, it is not only the spoken word that determines the drum literature, but drum literature often determines the spoken word. Orality is nothing but an abbreviated expression of certain constituents of a prior literature. This is really interesting. This is one of the things that the Mossi critic, Burkina Faso critic Albert Ouedraogo is going to challenge in the view of Pacere, and take a more traditional view that the language of the talking drums is a representation of the language of the human voice. But that's not what Pacere is saying here. Okay, this literature is forged by the drum, not by the man who has no other choice than to accept it, to submit to it. Now, this is a view that's akin to very contemporary, let's say even deconstructive views of language as being a kind of an autonomous, empirical, external force that interpolates human beings within it. Now, the Mande have a very similar proverb when they say, language is not in the hands of human beings. Human beings are in the hand of language. And that's what he's saying here as well. But the language that he's talking about is not the language of the human voice, but the language of the talking drum, which is empirical, external, and interpolates those who hear it into its own universe. For the most important rights of human life, he writes, the drum alone can express this language. The Bindra log the drummer employs phrases already made and presented to him in the presence of his ancestors. The man of tomorrow thus becomes a construction of today in the presence of his ancestors. And so we are interpolated into this language by having it performed when we are listening to it. So it's a really interesting and provocative way of thinking about what the drums really do and what their function is. And it really does force us to change our conception of what we think literature is if we take him at his word. So here he's going to speak of what he calls this term cultural literature is a very important term for him, which El Hadj Sekou Tall is going to compare to the more metaphysical idea of being, let's say, to put it in basic terms of the basic concepts of metaphysics, that the way that El Hadj Sekou Tall will interpret cultural literature is it's a metaphysical category. It's akin to the Western Platonic idea of being. The scene of the drum's performance is without limit, Pacere writes, and without orientation. All nearby elements assist it, becoming participants within it. Men, animals, nature. Everyone finally becomes an actor. There are no invisible spectators. If passersby stop to watch, they too become actors, not spectators. Everything becomes incorporated into the scene. Cultural literature is a language of bodily movement in a context that excludes description, a literature of movement, a message of bodily expression. And I can testify to this myself. I've been in many settings where you'll be walking through, let's say, Ouagadougou or some other town or village, and the drums will be playing. I'll give you one case. I was in Savare, and there was music being played, and I was just walking. I was going from my hotel to visit a friend, and I had to go down the street where this music was being played. And as I was walking, that my presence became observed by those playing, and suddenly the sound of the music changed, and everybody was looking at me, and my presence was eliciting a different kind of response from the drummer, and I became myself. I felt, as in the way that Pacere is describing here, incorporated into a kind of a scene. And I didn't even want to be. I just wanted to get to where I was going. But you can't. The point is that this is a small example, but you can't escape it. It's when you're in its presence, you are being interpolated into an entire universe, a language, as he says here, of bodily movement. Now he uses this word cultural literature, but the way Sekou Tall is going to interpret this, as I said, Alhaj Sekou Tall, is being is power or force, and force, it's being. So it means being. You can think of it as force. It's in effect a kind of a metaphysical totalizing concept for Pacere. Now here's a clip from Jean Rouche's Moro Naba.
Après le troisième tour, devant l'estrade du soleil, il s'arrête.
So that now Jean Rouche was a very prominent ethnographer and filmmaker who lived in West Africa at a time when there weren't a whole lot of cameras or there wasn't much footage of this part of the world. So he created a lot of footage and he made a lot of really interesting films, which you can find on the internet. So if you just go to YouTube, just Google Jean Rouche, you'll see a lot of films. The Moro Naba, which is the king of the Burkinabe, or the king of the Mossi, was made in 1957. It's an interesting film, but it's just one among many films that he made. And I wanted to show you that clip so you can see what the Mossi actually look like and what the sound of the drums are. I'm going to show you another one from 2016, a more contemporary one, similarly based on where you see the drums and what it sounds like and what Pacere is talking about. This is from Christopher Roy. You can find his website on the internet. So that's Christopher Roy. He's made a lot of really interesting films in Burkina Faso. I encourage you to check out his YouTube channel. This is a much longer film. I just showed you a brief clip from it, but I encourage you to go look at this film and other films that he's made, because he's made quite a few and they're all quite good. And this one is of a funeral of a Mossi, the Naba saga in Burkina Faso. So it gives you a sense of how I wanted you to see that, because the Rouge film was quite old, but this film gives, it shows you how vital and contemporary many of these practices still are, these cultural practices that Roy is documenting in this film. Now, here is Pacere. He's going to describe for us what happens when the bin Naba performs each morning and how what the function of the bin Naba, or the chief of the drummers in the Mossi culture is. He says the bin Naba, or the chief of drummers, is at the center of public life on an equal footing with the Mor Naba, or king. He is the first man in society. And it was Pacere himself who put those words in big caps. Each morning he awakens before all others, and with his drum invents the day. He creates, provides meaning to the seasons for everyone. Among the Mossi, the drummer is no mere accessory or marginal figure, but the center of society. In certain instances, he dictates what must be done. His sacred instrument, the drum, presides over all rituals. So it's quite interesting the way that the bin Naba, the chief of the drummers, head of the drummers, is in effect somebody who invents the day, and he provides meaning. So has a very important role in Mossi culture. So the drum, it's not just, again, the drum can be used to communicate. I mean, one of the things I don't like about Ong's theory of the talking drums is effectively he describes it as a kind of like a Morse code communicative system, and it can function in that way to send messages. But it's as you can see here in Pacere's articulation of this, it's much more spiritual and much more significant than a Morse code communicative system. It's at the very heart of Mossi culture for him. It says the drum message, Pacere tells us, is always intended for a restricted circle, a circle of cultured people at the highest social levels, people who make important decisions for the benefit of everyone. It goes without saying that we are not talking about a circle of children. It should also be understood that for the Mossi, being a child is never a question of one's actual age, but rather of one's spiritual development. The uninitiated cannot understand the language of the talking drums. And so it's an esoteric language in effect. Now, if you listen to let's say the epic of Askia Muhammad, or some of the other griot epics, you'll come across phrases that, like for instance, when Thomas Hale transcribed the epic of Askia Muhammad, he there are phrases he left untranslated because they're only known by the initiated. He couldn't find out what they were. And the same really is true as we're talking about a very secret, language. Now, I might note too that when you read Saglego, you'll come across passages that may seem shocking to you and even crude. But remember that it's only the most cultured people that know what is being said, and so there's nothing in here that would shock the ears, let's say, of a child or of a fool. Because the child or the fool would not have access to this discourse. It's people who are very disciplined and spiritual. Regarding the drum phrase and its construction, Pacere writes, there is embedded within the talking drum a language that differs from current Mori language, a language that is shared among the ancients. Even in the modern world, there are, of course, specialized languages for doctors, judges, mathematicians, and so on. So it is and has always been that within this specific milieu, there exists a specialized language reserved for certain distinguished people who are highly cultured and influential in society. For the most part, drum language functions within such a milieu as a zabiuri. Now, so it's an esoteric language. So like you could be a speaker of Mori, you could be a Mossi person who speaks Mori, but that doesn't mean that you're going to understand what the drum is saying. That only very specific kinds of people have the technical specialized knowledge of this language to be able to understand it. The zabiure, wrongly translated into French as a nom de guerre or a call to arms, is a device that signals an administrative action to be taken, an organ of power asserting its will, or simply the symbolic elevation of an individual to a higher rank. So again, the French translation he's putting out is nom de guerre. It's like a call to arms. We would translate that in English. But he's saying that that's not really what it is. It's not like, I mean, it can function that way. It can be time to go to battle, time to go to war, but it's not. It's far broader than that. It can involve any kind of administrative action as well, any kind of authoritative, sovereign decision that's being made and announced to those listening. Now, the technique of poetry within such a context, Pacere tells us, is to express an idea or develop a theme, but not with drum phrases commonly known. Rather, such phrases are pieced together by a sophisticated juxtapositioning of the zabiuya, or the mottos. Understanding drum poetry is like figuring out a complex puzzle. The worth or greatness of an elder depends upon his knowledge of such poems. For this reason, we have always emphasized that drum language is not merely esoteric. It is much more than that. It is a language between masters of thought, word, and deed. Each phrase, each word is consecrated for a particular constituency or an administrative organ, or for some aspect of social life. Songs, for example. Every possible Moray word first passes through drum language. So quite interesting. He underscores the complexity of the drum phrases and how very few are able to even interpret these complex puzzles and a person's cultural prestige as an elder. And remember, this is a gerontocratic society where ruled by elders. Essentially depends on their knowledge of the language of these poems. The drum phrase, the phrase of the elder, does not necessarily consist of a subject-verb complement. It may contain a subject but no verb, a complement but no subject, etc. This is true not only in the juxtapositioning of concepts, but also in fixed formulas older than a millennium. Okay, so note here, these formulas of the ancestors they're more than 1,000 years old that continue to be played in the present. This is the sense in which the voices of the past in these phrases continue to be alive in the present. Often the correspondence of verb tenses is not only unnecessary, but even unknown. The Zabiuya, each accepted without the possibility of modification, contain revelations from divergent points in time. The poet does not simply invent these phrases, rather he relies upon phrases that are sent to him by the gods, ready-made phrases preserved by his ancestors. The drum phrase implies a superior aesthetics and insight into the unknown, even the subversion of school-taught learning. So you can see there that it is indeed quite complex, and he underscores here again that the autonomy of this language. It's not like if we think of say the French Romantic idea of the poet being a kind of a genius or a fount of knowledge from whom the poetry flows. It's not like that at all. The poem is already out there in the external world. And the drummer who plays the poem has to accept the phrases that already exist, and then he works with them and transforms them. And so as we're going to see when we look at some fragments or some sections from Saglego, that these messages are not just messages that reaffirm traditional cultural values, although they do that, but they also can speak to very contemporary issues as well. In relation to the tamarind tree, one finds the following zabiure. The tamarind tree may fall upon the earth, but its good taste will remain forever. Now, in contemporary culture, Pacere tells us this phrase refers to African culture in the aftermath of colonization. Despite subjugation and defeat, its profundity and integrity remain unaffected. So this would be an example of, you could think of it as a kind of a received wisdom. The Zabiue addresses all themes of social life. They become key aphorisms for the cultured man who relies upon them when appropriate. And so they're they're really the glue that holds the community together. We can think of like what the rhetorician Giambattista Vico speaks of the sensus communis, or the common sense. They form the cement that holds society together. They're these nodal points that are essential to preserving a kind of a discursive integrity of the culture itself. Now here is a sample from Saglego. We're going to look at, it's called Saglego, or drum poem from the Sahel. So I just pulled out a few passages that I will look at and I'll comment upon. It says, "People of the earth, the first time." Now remember, this is being performed on the drum, and so you would be hearing this on the drum. This is Pacere is translating it from the language of the talking drums to Moray and then into French, and then I've translated it from there into the English. "People of the earth the first time, people of the earth the second time, people of the earth the third time, our respects. To our fathers, our respects. To our ancestors, our respects. To the gods of the earth, our respects." Now here, this is the beginning of the poem, the opening, and the people of the earth, he's referring to the Yoyantsi, the ancients who have been there very, very long. And so the poem begins by paying respects to them, and then respects to their fathers, to the ancestors, and to the gods. Now here, I like this part of the poem because it shows you an example of how it's not just a poem that is communicating the values of the past. It is doing that, but it's also speaking to the very urgent needs of the present. The man of discernment loves his work. Vaccinate your child. Vaccinate your child. Welcome the vaccination. The man of discernment vaccinates his son. Takes his child to school. Takes his child to school. The man of discernment opens the horizon for his son. Now this is wonderful, and you can see here how this very traditional poem is echoing the kinds of thought, the kind of thinking that you find, say, for instance, in the political speeches of Thomas Sankara. It was Thomas Sankara that started this commando vaccine campaign. Now, at a time when many of the Burkinabe had never been vaccinated. And so here you have the drum poem, the ancestors, in effect, reiterating the importance of vaccination in a context in which many people may have been very skeptical about. We've never vaccinated before. Why should we do this? And so here you have the validation of vaccination by the ancestors, in effect, by the language of the talking drums, and the importance of going to school. This is also one of Sankara's themes: is you got to get kids in school. And one of the problems even today is that children will be needed, because the economic situations that they confront are so dire that children will be taken from school and put to work and never have the opportunity to go to school. And here, again, we have the ancestors saying, no, let your kids go to school. If you're a man of discernment, you're going to open the world for your kids, and they need to go to school to do this. And so this is, again, traditional, but it's reaffirming and speaking to a very contemporary need. And so this is a wonderful instance of this dialogue between past and present. The man of discernment loves his work. Do not strike fire in the savannah, fire in the bush, fire in the bush. The man of discernment is no pyromaniac, never splits green wood, never splits green wood, never splits green wood. The man of discernment never chops what's green. So, we know today, particularly today more than ever, this has always been a problem, but today more than ever, this problem of desertification. And so deforestation. And so the ancestors here are urging the people, if it's green, let it live. Only chop down, only burn what is dead. This is a very important message. That is, we can think of the ancestors as having a kind of an echo consciousness as well, and urging the people to think about the preservation of the environment and fighting desertification. The man of discernment never chops what's green, never massacres wild animals, wild animals, wild animals, wild animals. The man of discernment never massacres what belongs to the wild. Sons of the brave, Kadiogo is still alive. The long life, listen to the counsels. Well, here, similarly, don't just go killing, animals. Again, this is a problem with animal poaching. Let animals disappearing from the continent. But the man of discernment doesn't just go out and kill animals. He lets what lives in the wild belong and live, because it's a part of being. It's a part of the world. Now, in the poem itself, Saglego, one of the wonderful things about this poem is this is a very brief introduction to this poem, but if you go read the poem, which I urge you to do, you'll see that Pacere provides very copious footnotes, and so that you can interpret these very complex phrases that otherwise would be just completely bewildering. But if you read the poem and then you go to the footnotes and you come back to the original, you'll see how complex indeed it is, and so that things that don't seem to make sense make total sense when you study the footnotes that he provides us. The man of discernment loves his work. The truth cannot be buried. Doesn't hide the truth. That sounds just like Norbert Zongo, in effect, who spoke out for the importance of speaking the truth. The truth cannot be buried. Doesn't hide the truth. Always follows the truth. The man of discernment loves the truth. Doesn't neglect the culture of the people. The culture of the people. The culture of the people. The pathway of the people's conscience rests upon culture. So speak the truth. Norbert Zongo, as I said in a lecture on Norbert Zongo, this is in the same lecture series, paid with his life for speaking the truth. But this was not just because he was a virtuous truth speaker, but he was that. But he was reiterating values that have always historically defined the Mossi people. And so we find these, again, virtue and truth speaking, truth telling, being affirmed by the language of the talking drums and the voice of the ancestors as well. And similarly, the man of discernment doesn't neglect the culture of the people. And this is Pacere. This was his message. This was the main message of Pacere. We need to preserve our traditional culture, and we find the talking drums reaffirming what Pacere has spent his life trying to instill this value of the importance of traditional Mossi culture. Now, some of the language of the poem, I pulled out this example. This is the kind of thing that can be very disturbing to to somebody who's reading this, who's not Mossi or who doesn't understand the cultural context. You go, what in the world is going on here? So I just pull this out as one instance that does require explication. But again, I urge you, I'll explicate this a little bit, but I urge you to go to the original poem. You'll hear Pacere unpack this in the footnotes. But he writes, but the language says, on the bed of the village chief, a chicken once left a pile of shit, and it splattered, yet there will be no punishment. The bunghole of the chicken doesn't think before shitting. It goes where it likes. On the bed of the queen, a chicken once left a pile of shit, and it splattered, yet there will be no punishment. Now, if you're looking at this, you go, what in the world is this talking about? But there's a lot of really interesting points that are being made, and it sounds almost kind of funny. It may cause you to laugh when you read it for the first time. But let me give you an example. The prominent American anthropologist Paul Stoller, who wrote on Sorcery's Shadow, spent many, many years, living, studying. He was in the Peace Corps with the Songhay, and he went to do anthropological studies of the Songhay, living among them for a couple of years, writing about them, and he couldn't get any information. The secrets were being hidden from him. And one day, a Songhay band friend of his was laying on a cot in his hut, and he was writing his notes, and these birds had come up in the rafter of his hut, and they shit all over him and all over his notes. And he was so furious, he started kicking things around. But the Songhay's friend of his who was on the bed, jumped up and started singing praises and said, yeah, now you've just received a blessing, and now we can initiate you into some of the secrets of Songhay sorcery. And this was very mystifying to Stoller, but it was the beginning of his training as a Sorko, as a Songhay sorcerer, because the man on the bed interpreted this as a sign. Now, historically, if we go back and like say ancient Egypt and some of the oldest cultures in the world, if we look at some of the very first images of deities, they always appear in the form of birds. In the Christian tradition, the Holy Spirit is represented in the form of a dove in the Trinity. So the birds have been often interpreted as in the past in traditional cultures, particularly in northwestern Africa, northern Africa, as bringing omens. And so a bird has a kind of a power as well. And in this case, I think, though, what this particular instance is really referring to, and you can refer to Pacere's original text, is that that even a chicken has a certain kind of power. If we put it in metaphysical terms, we could say, well, this is like Heidegger will speak of, in modern philosophers like Vattimo, the Italian philosopher, will speak of sort of a weak power. The animals have a kind of a weak power because they have a power. They're creatures within being, as human beings are, but they're contained within being in ways that human beings are certainly have. I mean, the way that Heidegger says this is that human beings are world forming. People are world forming, whereas animals have no. Or they're poor in world. And like I say, a stone has no world at all. So a chicken would be a being, but it would be poor in world. And yet even this being that is poor in world has a particular kind of power, as we see in this poem, that it can defile the bed of the queen. And yet no one would think of punishing a chicken for doing that, because a chicken is a chicken. And so this tells us something about I think what the philosopher Vattimo would call this weak power of the bird, that all things have power, and we have to respect those things that seem to be, even when we're like Stoller was, frustrated with these creatures. Now, the poem also refers to the termitary. Now, the termitary is a termite mound, and if you ever go to West Africa, you'll see these everywhere. The termite mound is a very powerful, important symbol in West African society, and I can't go into that fully here because it would require a long lecture in its own right. But I just want to note that the termitary, or the termite mound, which you'll see throughout the Sahel, is a really prominent and important cultural figure. And here the poem is referring to this figure as something that it draws our attention to. Like, I think among the Mossi, even like in some traditional instances, like if termites build a termitary within your compound, you have to leave. They stay, you leave. So it's a very, very important cultural figure. But here it says, the termitary is the work of 2 or 3 people. Add earth to the earth. If the termitary lives, it gives to the earth. If it dies, it remains flat ground. The horse's bed, restore to the earth. Give to the earth. The little termitary is the work of 2 or 3 persons. Add earth to earth. So it becomes, in this sense, even a symbol of communal labor that human beings perform to build a culture, and the termitary is a symbol of that. It serves a symbolic function in other ways as well. Like if you read the Conversations of Ogatameli that Marcel Griol transcribed, the Dogon philosopher, you'll see again the termitary there plays a very important role in that philosophical work as well. Sons of the brave, be magnanimous, be tolerant. The man of discernment also knows how to forgive. Sons of the brave, sons of the brave, sons of the brave. So note, this is a theme, like for instance, in the thought of Alhaj Sekou Tall, and Tierno Bouker Tall, and Amadou Ampateba, this question of tolerance. We have to tolerate others. We must be tolerant. That people who are discerning people who are wise, they tolerate difference, they tolerate others, and they know how to forgive. And that's certainly a lesson for all of us. Now, if you would like to study this poem, you'll find it in The Desert Shore. It's also, there's an introductory essay that explains the bendrology and takes excerpts from the language of the tom-tom and the language of the talking drums in Pacere's longer work that has not yet been translated into English. Hopefully it will at some point. And then there's also an essay included by Albert Ouedraogo that initiated a very interesting debate at the University of Ouagadougou. So I urge you to read Pacere and to get to know this figure who's done so much interesting work.